For about the last year, I've had this material rack on the roof of my 3500. And while it's great for moving material around, it sucks for opening my tonneau cover. It's been really frustrating, so I decided today I would finally fix it. Now, I needed to know how far I needed to move these bars so that I could modify them, so I just opened the rack and traced them, and then I could take this thing off and bring it into the shop. Now, this is a Magnum truck rack, and the whole thing is made out of welded aluminum, and aside from these kind of just being the wrong angle, it's been a really good rack. It's pretty high quality, and it's got a nice powder-coated finish on it. So I wanted to make some marks that would let me kind of know where the previous rack was, even though that wound up being totally useless. And really only marks I needed were the pencil marks I made when I opened up the tonneau cover and hit those vertical bars. Now I went ahead and I ordered basically the exact same material that these were made out of from Online Metals, so I would have the same stuff and hopefully get the same amount of strength out of this whole assembly. Now I actually went with a little thicker wall tube, but I don't really think that that's going to make a difference. It's just going to help me kind of be a little bit stronger, and it will look slightly different. Now I didn't measure the angle that I was going to need with any sort of protractor. I just figured I would do it by eye, and I would use my fixture table to sort of set up a little jig that would help me square everything up so that I could then make a reference mark off of the pencil marks that I made. It turned out that this wound up being about a 5-degree angle, but instead of measuring all that, I just basically used some squares and some various kind of scribes to mark a nice little mark on my new piece of aluminum that would get me outside of the pencil marks I made when I lifted up the tonneau cover. With all that done, I used my little shadow line trick on my saw to sort of trace out where I made my scribe line, and then when I looked down at the protractor on the saw, I noticed that it was about 5 degrees, which I'm happy with. I could have just made these straight, but I thought they would look a little nicer if they had a slight angle, and I thought figuring if I could make some amount of a triangle, it would give me some additional strength, and it would also make sure it still fit inside of the top rack bar that has to go and span between the two of these. Now I set up a little bit of a jig here on the edge of my table, and this is a relatively new welding table for me. This is a Sigmund 5x10 System 16. It's a beautiful table, and what I really like about it is that it has high sides, so it's really easy to kind of jig things up to the side of the table, which in this case is super helpful. Now the angle that came on the brackets from Magnum was kind of offset, and it was a slightly different material, but the thickness was the same, so I think it'll be fine. And I needed to cut that over on the portaband, which just took a couple seconds. With that all done, I could start to sort of jig everything up, and I set these bars in place here just so I could keep everything nice and locked down. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I am not a very experienced aluminum TIG welder. I've done it a bunch in the past, but it's really just not my strong suit. Welding is the kind of thing where just when you think you've got it 100% down pat, you try a new material or do something that you haven't really done a lot of, and it teaches you that you are not as good as you think you are. This was a humbling experience. Now, I have a new welder I'm using for this. This is an Aspect from a Lincoln Electric, and I'm pretty experienced with it doing steel, but again, with aluminum, I was having some trouble. That being said, the thing that I love about welding is that it is a constant learning process. I'm always trying to kind of branch out and do different materials and different processes and just learn as I go. And now in this case, I knew that I could create a really strong aluminum weld while not maybe necessarily the prettiest. Welding these thicker pieces of tube together was something that I just didn't have a lot of experience prior to. What I learned was that my heat was super important here, and I really didn't do a great job preheating the material, and I didn't do a great job cleaning it. So what I wound up doing was having to go back and grind out a couple of these welds and then redoing them. But again, this was a really good learning experience and pulsing my pedal and just getting a more consistent and even heat that would get me a good, well-penetrated weld without ruining the material. Now, when I did make a mistake, I was able to use these Alucut Pferd Burrs. These are kind of a special kind of deep gullet carbide burr. I made a whole video about these, and it just shreds aluminum, so it was easy for me to clean up my mistakes when I made them. With both of the bottom sections welded, I was able to grab another piece of some 3/16 aluminum and make what's going to be these little corner gussets. Now, before I did that, I punched the holes in the bolts sections for the top. These are 1/4" aluminum. And then I switched over onto my largest die, which I believe is a 7/8 on the iron worker, so that I could punch through this 3/16 aluminum to have a spot for my strap to go on these 45-degree gussets. Now again, I'm basically just stealing the design that came on the Magnum rack, because I just want to do something that's exactly the same, figuring that they've done some research and engineering into knowing that that design works, and thinking about the design of the rack. This 45-degree gusset, the way that it hits the leg of the angle, is going to really add a tremendous amount of strength to this little bracket. Now, I used some shims and some blocks to block this up, and then I could go ahead and weld it from the top. Now, because I was welding into the leg of this corner, again, I was getting a pretty thick piece of aluminum welded, and I really needed to sink a ton of heat in there to get it to fuse. And then when I did, I was globbing in some filler material. And again, not the prettiest welds, but they're certainly strong, and they certainly penetrated into that material and gave me a really nice weldment and bond. You can see as I'm doing this, I'm moving my clamps around to just kind of keep everything stable, and it's really helping me to have a fixture table to do this type of work. Now, I could have set up a really elaborate fixture to kind of make sure these things were exactly the same, but because I'm only making 2 of them, and because they are pretty straightforward in terms of their shape, I didn't go ahead and really fixture or jig everything. I just sort of used the clamps to my advantage. I used 1, 2, 3 blocks as spacers at wherever I could, and I just made sure that I was properly grounded by either grounding straight to the material or being clamped down to the table and grounding to the table, just to make sure that I had a nice, good continuity while I was making these welds. Now, these pieces got very hot while I was doing them, so I was kind of bouncing around between the two. But once they cooled down, I was able to set up one of these angle blocks and get ready to weld that top piece on. Now, here's another example of kind of making a mistake and then fixing it. I really wasn't getting this material hot enough, considering it was 1/4 inch thick on the bottom. So I wound up kind of having a couple bad welds that I had to grind out with those Alucut burrs. But again, these things just absolutely shred the material, and I'll leave a link to them down in the description below. If you're going to do any work with aluminum, I would definitely invest in a set of these, because if you use a regular fine cut burr, a lot of times you're going to chip weld whatever you are grinding with your carbide burr if the burr gullets and burr flutes are too close together. But with these Alucut ones, they just eat the material because there's a nice big gap in between them. And I've never found that I have any chip welding with aluminum with these, because of however they're designed, that aluminum just doesn't really stick to them. If you do wind up with stickiness on your burrs, I've actually found that you can use some kind of bar soap, just like regular old bar soap from the dollar store, and it'll help keep your aluminum and steel burrs clean and keep stuff from sticking to it. Now, with everything welded up, I went over to the downdraft table with a polyfan curve, which is the curved front flap disc, so I could go ahead and grind down some of these welds and clean them up a little bit. Now, I wasn't actually going to grind down the welds at all, but I thought it might kind of make things look a little nicer if I just sort of cleaned things up, and it would also give me a better opportunity to get some paint to stick to these if I roughed up the surface. Now, the last thing to do before I prime and paint is to mark out for these slots that are actually going to hold the wing nuts down onto the sides of the rack. Now, sorry, my camera got out of focus here, but I really just sort of traced what I had there, and the dimension on this is actually kind of important. Because if it's too high, the racks won't actually bear down on the bed rails, so it's pretty important that these are in the right spot. And then I can just go ahead and punch some holes with the iron worker and ream out whatever other holes that I drilled to the proper size. I drilled these out as well, and then I'm going to go ahead and take the bandsaw and cut out these slots. Now, sure, I could have gone ahead and chucked these up in the mill, and I could have used an end mill to make a really perfect and really clean slot, but at the end of the day, this all gets covered by a washer and wing nut, so I felt like there was no real reason to go super crazy. I could just cut this stuff with the bandsaw, which is pretty clean, and then just sort of clean it up with my little die grinder to make sure that there were no sharp edges or burrs that could get caught on anything. With all that done, I could go ahead and paint these things. Now I'm using a self-etching primer, and I'm giving this a good 24 hours to dry, just because I want this to have a nice bond on the surface. And then I'll go ahead and I'll paint this stuff down with some satin paint. Now, I kind of got the paint color wrong on this. I thought I wanted to use a satin, but it wound up being just a little bit too glossy. So I actually sanded these down again, primed and painted them again after this clip. And I went to a flat, which I still don't think is necessarily the right color. And I probably should have found a matte color, which would be better. So if anybody has any suggestions on where I could get a nice matte that will match the Magnum Black, let me know in the comments. Now, last thing to do is I wanted to add a little bit of plastic. I was looking for some HDPE, but all I had was this Starbord, which I think is pretty similar. And basically what this is going to do is give me a little wear plate that would slide on the racks. You can see on the brackets that came from Magnum, there was a white piece of HDPE. And again, I didn't have anything in that exact thickness, or I did have something in that exact thickness, but it wasn't the same material. And I did have to round over the edge so it would fit nice inside that angle. And with that done, these things can be reinstalled. The installation of these is super simple. There's a couple of sort of T-bolts, so you can kind of slide and lock everything in the right position, then you tighten it down. And you can see the way that there's that little 5-degree angle. You can see the flat black paint does match pretty well, but it's not perfect. And once I get everything all kind of cinched up and tightened up, look at the way that that tonneau cover works now. So now I can put material on the roof and I can still open my cover, keep all my tools dry, keep it from getting stolen, and it's really going to be a huge improvement to the use of this rack. I think it came out good despite some of the welds being a little bit ugly, but overall I'm really happy with it, and honestly I wish I would have done this a year ago. So I'm super happy with how these came out. I've been moving some long material during a renovation on my house, which will be in some future videos, and it's been great to put the material on the rack and be able to put stuff in the bed. This was a great little project, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Nothing too fancy here, but I learned a little bit along the way, and if you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you on the next one.